Well, I think, and I have posted my sentiments on this question, and said that perhaps what we need to do, like I said yesterday on my social media platforms, what we need to do is to have a serious conversation with ourselves as a country. Number one, yes, there is the systemic issue where there is compromise in terms of following the laid down safety requirements in schools. And like many other speakers before me have said, there is also the need for us to also focus on, put pressure on the government in terms of the enrollment. Lack of expansion in the schools infrastructure is obviously reason cause for the congestion that we are seeing. But beyond that, I think what we see, the behavior comes down to how as parents we are raising our children. And I think I couldn't agree more with Dr. Dan when he says that perhaps as parents we are also very busy chasing the money, and we don't even know our children. We are leaving our children in the hands of teachers and nannies at home and other relatives who are not busy, and all we care about is to provide. And this is also an indictment on the parents and how seriously we take our responsibility in terms of raising our children. And Hillary, you probably know about this, as many of our listeners would, that I think there is this famous pastor, Pastor Elizabeth Mokoro, who says that we are leaving our children to just grow. And children don't just grow, they need to be raised. And they are raised in an environment where family values, where, the basic appreciations or concepts of life are inculcated in them. For example, the important value of hard work, patience, for instance, perseverance, and being able to soak in the pressure. And I'm not saying that our children, we have to subject them to certain level of hardships for them to understand life, but I think there is a way we are raising our children today that also indicts us directly. So my way of looking at it is this, and I think those of you who have had exposure with education in the developed world would bear me out, that the concept of boarding schools is one that we need to ask ourselves whether we actually need to have. And my respectful opinion is that we need to do away with boarding schools unless it's necessary, so that we have them as an exception rather than the norm. Because as it is right now, it is the norm that any parent, there's a lot of focus in boarding schools. People feel boarding schools are better. People feel they are better resourced, and therefore we want to send our children there. But also, we end up in a school year, it's about 9 months of schooling, and our children would be home for about 3 or 4 months. So the rest of the time, basically, we don't know our children. We meet them, bado kama kuna ile hype, you've missed your child. So before you even get to know, before you start getting upset about the things that they are doing or bad behaviors, they are already going back to school, and everything goes back, resets. And so I think for me, let's, yes, evaluate for purposes of posterity and planning in terms of policy. Let us have this conversation about the state of infrastructure, the question of congestion, the issues to do with how the facilities in those schools are. But I think we need to suspend learning in boarding schools. We need to suspend learning, as it were, and this speaks to the petition that I have put out. Let us suspend learning in secondary schools and have a serious conversation. Let us take stock of what is it that we have in terms of schools. at the ward level, going up to the county level, more like what you have in the West, in the US and Canada, the school districts, so that we are able to know what our numbers are in terms of the school-going children at that level. But we also look at what do we have in terms of schools that are ready to take these children, so that we set up a day school system in the country. Why is that important? It is also important because it takes away the pressure of the few national or so-called C1 and C2 schools, and so that the baseline is a day school. So the question we would then need to have is, once we have that evaluation and that analysis, we would then begin the process of onboarding children into these schools at the local level, at the ward level as a reference point. And then we scale it up, and then we see where there would be need on a case-by-case basis. We can then establish a few boarding schools for specific cadres of professionals. You know, for instance, the military, essential services, that, exceptional cases that need to have their children in boarding schools. And we establish those boarding schools in, in drips and spills, if you like, so that you probably have like 1 or 2 per region. Let's say all the provinces, if we have like 2 in Nyanza, 2 in Nairobi, so that we can control, and that will be informed by the numbers and the statistics that we have. Then the question for me would be, what do we do with the national schools that have been heavily there has been heavy investment over time, and which have become the envy of many. Every parent, every child wants to go to Alliance, to Mangu, to Kisi School, and other places. So for me, the question, and to answer that question in terms of what do we do with the infrastructure of the national schools, the boarding schools, some of which are very well resourced, we can then translate those schools and set them up as community colleges or TVETs, which can then be now national higher learning centers at the intermediate level. Number one. Number two, depending on the structure that they have in terms of infrastructure and capacity, they can also be adopted by universities and other centers of learning and be transformed as campuses or research centers for the different institutions, so that we can then have them as incubation centers, as centers of excellence in whichever field that we look at. If you're talking about IT, for instance, if you're talking about agriculture, it can be in the space of, human rights, and depending on the infrastructure level, we can have them for science. We can have, for example, the issues we have about quarantine centers. Some of these schools could be used as medical facilities or quarantine centers or centers for specialized medical care for cancer, for different kinds of ailments or diseases. That way, we would have addressed this issue in a deeper sense, and would have a solution where parents and the community can be engaged in the business of raising our children. Because Hillary, Abdi, and fellow Kenyans, and whoever is listening to me, the business of raising children is a full-time job, is a full-time engagement that you undertake from when a child is born until they successfully transition into adulthood, or otherwise, in the extreme cases or unfortunate cases where then they are not as successful and they have to deal with, the different systems of law in terms of dealing with themselves as adults. That, for me, would be the solution to what we are having. And I dare say it may take time, not 1 month, not 2 months, not even 3 months. But if that is what it will take, I would rather we do that to save our children. We would save the 16 innocent lives that were lost, wouldn't have been lost, and would also give the parents and the society an opportunity to introspect and reflect on the values that we are passing on to the generations that are coming after us. That would be my submission as far as that is concerned.
Dr. Milton, very quick question. I think let me take you back to the Utimishi girls incident. I think it raises a broader national question beyond the individual conduct or the upbringing you talked about. How is it possible that the school hosting hundreds of learners could face a fire emergency with such devastating consequences despite being located only a few kilometers from a military installation and a state emergency infrastructure? This is I don't know, I can't even bring it together. And what does this reveal about Kenya's disaster preparedness system in schools? Fire detection, evacuation drills, emergency response time, interagency coordination, and enforcement of safety standards. What reforms are needed to move from reacting to disasters to preventing them? You know, always you have seen here, we always do a fire drill, right? Every few months we do a fire drill, we do all this. But it never happens. Look at the infrastructure. There is a military barracks in Gilgil there that should have responded. Why are we not having this intergovernmental whatever connections?
Abdith, that is a very, very good question. And I would, first of all, begin by saying I've actually just started taking a course on emergency management. And I'll tell you, the questions around our emergency preparedness and our capacity to respond to disaster couldn't have been exposed more. But I think this is not something new. We've seen it in the past. And what we see is a lack of deliberateness in terms of how we, capacitate the different institutions at different levels to be able to deal with emergency and disaster when it strikes. I'll tell you this, and this is something that I have learned for the 2 weeks I've been since I started this course on disaster management, that there is something called disaster science. And disaster science is the melting pot of all the different dynamics that come or speak to emergency and disaster situations. It has in it the mitigation, first of all, awareness. It brings into play the question of how prepared are we to mitigate. And number two, in the event that then the mitigations are not good enough, then how do we respond? And response is meant to ensure that the level of fatality is minimized and lives are saved. So ultimately, what we are seeing is a lack of capacity, to answer your question directly. And what we are also seeing is that nobody seems to care. And where somebody attempts or purports to do something, they do so as a way of advancing the wanton runaway corruption that we are seeing in the country, because all these counties are at different levels of governance. We have so-called emergency response programs. We have, the safety and security plans, which are part of emergency preparedness, are there as mere documents that have been developed, and they are just academic. There are no facilities. When you hear that an emergency door, an emergency exit would be closed and inaccessible, I mean, that tells you about our ability to respond and how seriously we take the question of disaster preparedness. But I think it is an indictment on all of us. It is an indictment on those in government. But I think the office of the citizen needs to be more engaged. We need to be more participatory in terms of demanding for more, and we have to shift from the system where those in positions of power, those we have delegated the privilege of exercising power on our behalf, we look at them as knows it all. People who know everything, people who are supposed to talk to us and tell us what we are supposed to do or what we are supposed to have. So we need now to have a more civically engaged population. We need citizens who are aware, who put into practice the academic awareness that we have, the level of public and national consciousness that we have, so that we can hold them accountable by saying that this is what is expected in terms of emergency response, in terms of governance, and unfortunately you're not doing enough. And the little that you're doing is not even anywhere close to what the right thing is. That is what we need to have as a conversation, and we need to then use the victims of these fatalities, of these disasters, as the collateral investment, as capital, for us to demand for more, for us to demand for better. And the way to do it is to continue having these conversations by way of having memoranda. Kenyans exercising, invoking the provisions of Article 37 of the Constitution, which is supreme, invoking the provisions of Article 10 of the Constitution on public participation, which now Aden Duale wants to tell us can be dwarfed by a policy decision, which is, rather unfortunate. Kenyans need to be more engaged. We need to move these spaces to the villages. We need to engage our people more, and we need to demand for more accountability from those that are exercising power. And when they fail, like they have failed in the case of Utumishi as the latest incident, I'll tell you, my son's school yesterday was visiting day. The school, the kids started burning the mattresses, and they had to be sent home. But what my son was telling me later on is that unrest has been going on for the last few days. And you ask yourself, why would the leadership and the administration of the school wait until this happens instead of nipping in the bud, eating the bud? That again speaks to our software issue. The challenge we have is not the hardware as it were per se. It is also about our attitude, our mentality, and our general software in terms of how we look at things.